Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Nature Folklore Sessions. It's the 2nd of May, 2021. Well, thank you for joining me on this weekly time of exploring nature-centered folklore, connecting to this within your favorite sanctuary space, and expressing your inspired visions from your sanctuary, your choice of sanctuary, through hopefully your poetry, your writing, arts, craft, performance, and problem solving. So thank you for joining, because it is a bank holiday weekend. It's the May Day weekend here. I must apologize today that this is going to be just me. I don't have guests, and due to some tech issues, I'm going to do this without photographs today. So I trust there'll be plenty of wonderful information. I'll have the photographs when I do this next year, so that's something to look forward to. So I hope you like the wee stories and the traditions that I'm going to go through. But more important, I trust you're having a great May Day time, a Bealtaine time that you probably would have started celebrating in some way. And hopefully you'll put into your comments some of the traditions that you are following through at this time, and celebrations and what you're honoring. But this today is truly back into the folklore, and it's going to be like this today and next Sunday as well, which is going to be sort of a continuation. So it really is nature folklore. Now, this afternoon's theme is Bealtaine, whatever you say, flowers, and the May bush folklore, and there's going to be other folklore as well. I'm going to be exploring yellow flowers, why it is a celebration of yellow flowers at the moment, the Holy Wells Association, rolling in the Jew tradition, the twin fires, about the twin fires that the cattle get driven through, quite a bit on the traditions of the May bush and some of the suspected origins of that, and the May Queen as well, and how that leads on to that, and the Maypole as well. Now, there's no guest today, no one volunteered for today, but I think next Sunday, we will be full of guests, and so I get an easy day next Sunday. Now, these Nature Folklore Sessions and Carracroy Labyrinth Gardens, as I say, is beautifully brought to you thanks to the subscriptions of our lovely Patreon subscribers, which helps to pay the subscriptions I have to pay to keep this on. So thank you for your support, those who are doing that. Extra support from new listeners, new watchers, greatly accepted, because I might not be here this afternoon if it wasn't for that help. So thank you very much. So first of all, let's see who's joining us on this 2nd of May Bealtaine weekend. We got Sherry, regular, lovely. Hello, everyone. May Day weekend. Kimberly's here. Kimberly Kibansky. Good morning from Massachusetts. And Shell's here. Thank you for being on board, regulars here so far, which is fantastic. And Donna's turned up in New Mexico. Tiny yellow flowers in a labyrinth yesterday. We're going to have to come back to your labyrinths again sometime, Donna, because they're beautiful. And because Donna's very much into the labyrinths. And happy Bealtaine, Donna's saying as well. And they made Donna smile. So we're going to be talking about the smiling of the yellow flowers at this time. Fleabane daisies, and our desert has lovely flowers. And not a lot of them, especially at this time. So Val here. Hello, Val. Val Robus. If you're familiar, I'm going to punch her in here. A lovely woman. You're probably familiar with her Magnum Lady blog. Check that out. She gives a beautiful insight into Sligo, what's on. And also she has some wonderful coverage of Leitrim, because she works for a company in Leitrim as well, and Mayo. So keep checking a Magnum Lady blog. There's a lot of good things there, and also on her Twitter and Facebook page. Look her up. So thank you for being with us, Val. And to say sorry that we haven't got the photos today. I did have a technical hitch, so I'm going to actually do this whole show without photographs. So that's going to be quite exciting for me. Anyways, Donna, hello, and I got a computer hitch already. There we go. World Labyrinth Day, of course. I'm not going to cover that one. There's a bit of a conflict with that World Labyrinth Day being on the 1st of May as well. It's difficult to incorporate the whole lot in. So we'll have a labyrinth time. I think it's in a couple of weeks' time. I'm not sure. Maybe 3 weeks' time, towards the end of May. But I did go out to the house. Unfortunately, where we are here, the traditional yellow flower is the marsh marigold. But the farmer by us used to have a lot of marsh marigolds in the field next to ours, but he ploughed it up and he's sowing oats there, and all the marsh marigolds are gone. So the best I've done is a posy or a knot. I'm going to tell you why it's called a knot later on. So I've got the daisies, and the tree labyrinth is absolutely full of cowslips right now. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm going to have to put some photos of them in position actually on the Facebook and maybe the Twitter as well. So thank you for joining us. There's Sharon May Nichols come along with us as well. Thanks very much. And so yellow flowers, let's start on that. And I'm going to go straight in. I don't know how many of you tuned in when I did this Bealtaine weekend last year, but I told the story of the flowers, and rather than repeat it, I'm going to give myself a couple of minutes break. And this is how I actually presented it, just with an iPhone, actually, last year in the tree labyrinth, because I couldn't be in the tree labyrinth today because of little drizzly showers. So let's get a bit of tree labyrinth and birds singing and the rest of it. So this is a story of yellow flowers. Is it one I kind of often go into a story, a child I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do that one again. It seems we've got a weak signal. Unfortunately, the internet is going a little bit flat here. How is it with you? Is it all mumbled? I was having internet problems a little bit earlier, about 10 minutes ago, which is very unusual. We usually have a very good signal here, and but unfortunately, I'm getting a warning. The warning has gone away. So do you mind if I start that up again? I'll start that story up again, and let's hope we don't lose the signal this time. Ordnance survey map. And I'd only just learned to ride a two-wheeler, the stabilizers hadn't long gone. And I used to venture off. I knew how to use a compass. I learned how to use a compass, how to use the map. And I was bold. I venture off in this little bike. And if adults knew where I went, they would be horrified. It certainly wouldn't get away with it today. But I was looking for stone circles, holy wells, cairns. And there was one, when I turned up at these places, they were often on farmlands. And I'd be polite, I'd call at the farm and ask for permission. And, oh, what do you want to see those old stones for? And I'd often invent a fairy story for Bealtaine time, for May time. Just to get a foot in, because I was really interested in the stories for these, not the archaeology. Certainly not as a wee kid. I probably didn't even know what archaeology was, let alone spell it. But this one I knew actually had a May association, a Bealtaine association. So I went off to cycle towards this one, and this was during my early Yorkshire years in West Riding between Bealtaine and Ilkley, and there is a stone circle near Ilkley, the 12 Apostles, that's quite famous. So the one I was heading for was actually not far away from there, and so I cycled away, and I recognised from the map where the actual farm entrance was. And beside the farm entrance, there was a church, and the church wasn't used. It looked as if it hadn't been used for a long time. It still had the old wooden door, oak or ash or whatever it was, and above the door the little bell tower, and it was a very rusty bell and looked as if it hadn't been rung for 100 years. It was obviously a church that people had ignored for a long time. There were people milling around, very interested in the church, in the gravestones, but they looked as if they travelled in from far distances to visit this church. And I didn't want to disturb them, and I didn't want to even get close to them. There was no gate on the churchyard. There were a few gravestones. So I just sort of sat inside and pondering. It was a lovely day. It was like this. And I was looking over to the horizon, and the horizon was actually quite similar to the view that I'm actually looking here. There was the rolling hills, and there were wooden coppices, spinneys, and there were like snaky kind of rows of trees that obviously followed the brook or the burn. But the fascination to me at that time was the horizon. You could see horizon. Oh, what's beyond the horizon? Anyway, I was looking to where the sun was probably setting, so I had a wonder about where the sunset went. And then I suddenly thought, well, I'm actually dawdling this afternoon away. If I don't get going, I'm not going to be able to see this stone circle. Anyway, the track to the farm was next to this church, and I started going upward, and it was almost like the bell on the church, as if it hadn't been travelled on for 100 years. And as I went along it, there were wildflowers, and there were trees each side, and they had blossoms on them. And as I was going up this track, the trees seemed to get bigger, and the amount of blossoms on them were quite a bit bigger. There was more of them, and I was seeing all these yellow flowers on the sides. There was one or two cowslips, there was certainly plenty of primroses, and there was lots of dandelions. And I got some dandelions here, and there we have a cowslip here, because around here the cowslips are actually much more, they're very abundant, much more than the primroses. So I started picking these, and I started putting them into the saddlebag because my little bicycle actually had a saddlebag, and went up to the lane. And just before I got to the farmhouse, these trees were really big with the blossom on, and as they were getting bigger, there was much more fragrance, and I was really mesmerized, almost enchanted by the fragrance of these white flowers. Anyway, I got to the door of the farmhouse, I knocked on the door, and as usual, it's always the farmer's wife, and it's always as usual, I could barely say a word. Oh, runs off, gets the farmer comes to the door, very tall, of course, me, little boy. Every farmer, every man looks very tall. He didn't have a hat on. You expect farmers to have a hat on, but he had kind of straight, he had a short back and sides, but the top bit was sort of hair that sort of came down the side sort of thing. And he had a leather jacket, brown leather jacket on, and the sleeves were a bit ripped. And he had suit trousers on, and the thing I was thinking of, doesn't look like he used those suit trousers for a wedding or a funeral for a long time. And he had a white shirt, and the white shirt, well, it wasn't exactly white anymore. Anyway, and he was propping himself up with a stick, and it actually had a bit of a ram's horn on it, but I don't know what the wood of the stick was. And I said that I've come to see the May circle. And he knew exactly what he meant, and I didn't really have to do much explaining. He did come out with the grumpy stuff, I don't see why you want to see a bunch of old stones, but you had a bit of that. But this time he offered to take me, because obviously he thought, well, what's this little squeak doing on the farm? I better be cautious. So he kind of went with me, and I started picking more of the flowers, because there was yellow flowers. I just loved yellow, and they were mainly dandelions, and even around here mainly dandelions. And as I was picking at them, he was looking at me, and I thought, oh, perhaps he thinks it's odd, a little boy actually picking flowers. Up until that point, he'd been telling me a few stories, and they were all melancholy stories about people in his family that had died, and it was melancholy of the things that he missed.
But he reached over when I had the bunch of flowers, and he started touching the petals, and he started smiling, and he said, they're pretty, aren't they? Of course they're pretty. But right then, his stories, the mood of his stories changed. He started bringing the fairies in at that point, so there were fairy stories, and they were kind of bright, cheery stories, telling of good deeds that people did. And as we got closer to the circle, he turned round to me, and he kind of was looking a little puzzled, because one thing I asked was, do you have any stories about yellow flowers? And he looked and he said, well, I suppose you're here to ask lots of questions. Let me tell you now, there's no answers. There's no answers. Questions never have any answers. He's just going on, he said, it was a waste of time actually looking for answers. You know, he says, beginnings, they have ends. Ends, they have beginnings. Just look over in the yonder there. And of course, I've been doing that at the church. Look at the yonder there, as far as we can see, onto the horizon. And that's what we can see. But there may be some people like us on the horizon, and they're looking further over onto the other horizon. And he thought, yeah, okay. And he was giving me a lot of this philosophy. And he said, you know, questions, again he went on, he said, questions are a waste of time. You know, every person we meet, every animal that passes by, every bird that twitters over is part of our life, and it remains part of our life. And so the question that I was in my mind, and I didn't dare ask him, well, what's you in my life then? What important part of you in my life? Anyway, obviously I couldn't take that much further. Anyway, we got to the stone circle, that had the Bealtaine fairy story, which I won't actually go into, otherwise I'll be going on forever. But right by this stone circle was one of these trees that had the white blossoms, and this one was enormous. And I was more interested in that than the actual circle. I was staring at that, and my guide there, he actually had these big sort of glasses, big round glasses that were thick. Anyway, he sort of looked and he said, that's the fairy tree. And that's what he said. Just, that's the fairy tree. And it was him that wandered off to the stone circle, and most of the stones were actually fallen. Nobody had come along, archaeologists, nobody had tried to prop them up to try and form a circle. It was just most of it was a pile of fallen stones. But I was intrigued more by this tree. There was something that drew me to it, whilst the farmer man himself, he was drawn to the stones, and he was wandering quietly. And it was actually starting to get late, because I had left it late, and it was probably around tea time by now. There was that primrose you get from the sun when it gets into the evening. But he didn't seem to mind. He didn't seem to be rushed. He didn't seem to be hungry and needing back to the tree. But around this big tree, a lot of the blossoms had already fallen. And there was a whole different fragrance. It kind of was sort of a musty, and it kind of reminded me a bit of the melancholy stories that the farmer had told me as we were approaching to there. Anyway, I sat down and I had my little bunch of dandelions. I took one out of my bunch and I placed it there because I felt sorry for these blossoms that didn't have the fragrance they had before. So I felt it was quite important to leave them there. And the farmer, I had a quick look at the stone circle, and the farmer said, he says, actually, I'm sorry, but we've got to go now, I've got to get back. But he said, there's going to be a time that I come back here and I won't be leaving. I kind of looked what that meant. But I didn't ask questions. And he sort of reminded me on the way back, we walked back. So what he talked about, it was, questions, there's never any answers, it's just a waste of time. What is nice is to allow those questions to be your life. That's what creates our life, is all those questions. And we were just getting to the farmhouse. And the one thing he did say to me, he says, after today, he says, you're only a wee little boy. He says, it won't be long before you'll actually forget where you've been here. You'll forget me. And the only memory you'll have is of the emotions and what you felt on that day. That's all. That will sometimes come up, he says, the feelings and the emotions. The details will be gone. You'll forget all the details. But, he said, there's no harm in actually making up some details and putting around emotion and making a story out of it. So we got to the house, we said our farewells, and because it was downhill, I could actually ride my bike down, and it was starting to get a wee bit dark. And when I got home, it was getting very dark, so I had some explaining to do. What the heck was I doing on my bike out this late, not coming back for tea and so forth? But I had these bunch of yellow flowers, posies as they tend to be called today. And so I handed this over. And of course, when people look at the yellow flowers, all the sort of anger and all the sort of discipline that was going to be enforced on me just washed away. So I got away with it that time. And the one thought I had for a while after that, I still have that thought, is the one dandelion and its lovely yellow petals by this big tree with the blossoms that have fallen, of eventually these petals losing the yellow colour, fading away, separating from the stem and becoming part of the ground and becoming part of the tree. But even so, what reminds me is when I do pick some yellow flowers, I still have that memory, I still have that emotion of the smiling that happens when you look at yellow flowers.
Right. Now, that's good. Well, thanks for watching that again. It may have been a completely new story to some of you there. But that's the imagery of flowers that I love to share with people on this May time. And I think a lot of people, especially yellow, blooming yellow flowers, and it reminds them this is the time of the longer daylight of the sun. And sometimes I feel that this is the yellow flowers, I get my little posy again for those that are new here. I feel that this is a lovely reminder, a fantastic imagery of the warming transition from spring to summer. And as Donna was saying, who here doesn't smile when they see yellow flowers? So there you go, there's the yellow flowers. Daisies and primroses, as I say, the traditional marsh marigolds, they were ploughed up in the field near us, which is very sad. So there you have the primroses, the cowslips, the furze, the dandelions, and what's missing is our marsh marigolds. But yellow, well, that's my favorite color anyway, so I'm really biased with this today. And in Gaelic Scotland, there at Gael Argyll, May Day is probably from late medieval times, and it's been known from that time as the Lathabui Bealtaine, which is the yellow day of May. So I suspect there's similar tradition or naming in Donegal and other Gaelic areas of Ireland. So I feel that we're celebrating this Gregorian yellow 1st of May, when yellow flowers are abundant. I've explained the whole Gregorian thing here before. I think I'll talk about it a bit later. But we're following the Gregorian calendar, 16th century from Pope Gregory. And he actually put it together at some one time. But say the farmer drained we haven't got the marsh marigolds. But even so, the rituals and observations now in May, they're not just for human fertility, really, but people use this time for joy and also connecting to nature with their prayer and protection. But what happens now, really, and how we approach now, it determines the health of the crops, the reared animals through the summer growing and the autumn harvest. That's what Bealtaine used to be. We're perhaps quite disconnected from that now. And even all that happens through the summer is really about our future winter survival, bringing us completely around in a complete circle, our survival with our food, health, and shelter. And May Day and Bealtaine are observance, respect, ritual, and all that fun, I feel is a beautiful highlight time that we can passionately connect to. We can passionately connect back to the land, all life, and the season changes of the year. And I feel this is so important through our modern life now, because we tend to live according to priorities of science, digitals, fashion, and trend setting. And to understand that all this status, grooming, modernization is all still rooted down our natural heritage. And I apologize again, I haven't got the photos. I had a lovely photo presentation of this, but I'll have it next time. But if you can imagine all this. But I feel this is a reminder we need to apply at least part of ourselves into restoring and preserving our landscape. And there's a lot of movements, a lot of groups on the social media of people getting together back to the land, and they're sharing tips of how people used to do things along with their discoveries. And these traditions that we have at this time, I think, help us to align ourselves to caring and towards a sustainable future. Excuse me for the sore throat. But for me, this is my favorite and most special festive time of the year, despite, of course, my favorite color being yellow. And my mother's middle name was actually May as well, despite being born at lunar August, which is also a yellow golden time. So here I am again, perhaps for the last time, showing the yellow posy, which is supposed to be the main tradition at this time right now. But I think the yellow posy is actually a young tradition that really started getting wheels from the 19th century, the start of the Celtic Romantic age. But the tradition of yellow flowers may well have been in pockets, rural pockets, up until way back to late medieval times. So yesterday was the 1st of May, and it was quite frosty here anyway, but it soon melted away into heavy dew at sunrise. And there was sun, just like yesterday. Anyway, any comments on that so far, the yellow flowers? Because I'm talking about frost and dew, I'm going to start talking about rolling in the dew. Donna loved the story. Thank you very much. You remember it from last year. And Sharon as well. Great. So rolling in the dew. I don't think I even talked about this one last year. So let's get on with this lovely tradition. Especially, is it today that's supposed to be the do gardening naked day or something like that today anyway? But I've been hearing from some people who actually did their annual rolling in the dew yesterday on May the 1st for Bealtaine. And it's a tradition for cleansing, a form of baptism, really. So we're in the time when people try anything with what's going on, the big C, to protect themselves, protect their health. So some people are even rolling in the dew naked yesterday on May Day. Of course they are. But sorry, I didn't have any pictures of that anyway, so that's not missing. But rolling in the dew, it reminds me about how people approach the holy wells. They approach holy wells with the intent of personal cleansing, healing, drinking the water, and collecting the holy water. And also collecting water with the rolling in the dew, followed by a visit to the well. Some people do that as well. So other visits to trees, like I mentioned in that story, the hawthorn tree. I will cover hawthorns and the blossoms next week, so I won't talk too much about them this Yeah, what I'll move on to, there's a bit of a calendar confusion. People have always asked me this on the Facebook because I call this May Day. They always say there's a day in the week, even a time in the week, which is the point of Bealtaine, the sidereal time. So let me spend minutes to explaining this. So, and even in the names, Bealtaine, 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 Bealtaine. These are all names people apply to this holiday, and with all Celtic-y cross-quarter and solstice and equinox holidays. So all this tends to confuse people. But I was brought up with an astrology family. I was brought up with astrology, and family were astrologers, boat-loving, and they were herb-loving as well. And they did a lot of their crafts according to the ancient founded sidereal time. And the sidereal time, by legend, is supposed to have originated in 25,000 years ago in Babylon, but it was probably more like later the Persians 10, 12,000 years ago, and the Egyptians kind of tagged onto that and quite educational. Of course, when the Greeks set up their universities, it was very big in Greece as well. But sidereal time and its relationship of planets and star positions in the sky is what is happening on Earth. The ancients learned how to take angles because they learned calibrations and angles, and so they used points in the sky as a form of measurements, like what surveyors do, in order to understand movements and what's going on Earth. And this enabled navigation. It was due to sidereal time that navigation was possible and sea exploration happened, and how migration happened by the ancient people. And it started off with the understanding of the sidereal time and the positions and the movements in the sky in relation to Earth. I hope that makes sense. And that was so. Sailors, navies, they use sidereal time as their point of reference up until recently. It's only recently they've applied digital and laser technology, which has sort of taken the sidereal time out. Anyway, most humans today, they seem to have been brought up with the calendar doctrine, as I say, of Pope Gregory, and he launched his calendar at Sawan 1582. And some restored and reconstructed megalithic sites. Actually, because over the last 100 years, especially the last 50 years, there's been a rebuilding of megalithic sites, especially after the popularity of Stonehenge being rebuilt in the 50s. But some of these megalithic sites, they've even changed the alignment, which was based on sidereal time. They've changed them to the Gregory time, so that it matches the Pope Gregory calendar. And one of those is actually on a site in Sligo, Carramore, outside Sligo town. Good example where the entrance had been changed from the sidereal to the Gregory time, so that the I forget which time of year it is. Is it the solstice? But one of the sunrises goes directly in on the 1st of the month. It probably is today, or yesterday, 1st of May, if there was sunrise. But the one thing about 1st of May, one of the problems with the Gregory calendar, is the hawthorn flowers are not blossoming yet. Often the hawthorn, the first flowers, can come out quite close to the sidereal time of Bealtaine. So to me, and to a lot of rural people who didn't understand the mathematics of sidereal time, to them, Bealtaine started when the hawthorn came out in blossom. And I'll explain more about that next week. And so that could be after the sidereal time. Some people say, oh no, they watch for the moon, but definitely Bealtaine, because of the legends and the traditions around the hawthorn flowers. That's when Bealtaine starts. Anyway, the sidereal time I'm talking about is the cross-quarter time. But today in Ireland, at least this is the Bealtaine weekend holiday. It's convenient. It's a time when we can actually get fully into it. There's a bank holiday Monday. Unfortunately, the weather's not the best. We got sun, it's cold, but it's very convenient to celebrate now. and it's not with us this year. Let's see what you got to say. As I say, I think that's enough. Otherwise, I'll confuse you more about time. Oh, there's been some rolling in the dew. There we go. And Lillian. Oh, very good. So Lee and Lillian have some dew rolling. They sell lovely salads and fermented stuff at the Boyle Market. And Val, she's been washing herself in the May dew. And I hope the dogs didn't beat me to it. I got something about that coming up. So hold on. There's actually a lovely tradition around that. That's quite funny you say that, Val, because I'm going to be talking about that as well very soon. And Sherry, I'm glad you love that story. So let me continue on this. Let's go on to the Holy Wells now. After that, with a rolling in the dew and a bit of date explanation. Holy Wells, very good connection to Bealtaine, the early May time. A lot of people think of Bealtaine on fires. I'm going to talk about that later because I think there's a bit of a mix-up in tradition there. So I always tell a story or two about Lazare, and that relates to Bridget wells as well. And the simple story is the women are drawn to these wells and they look into them for visions. And to keep this simple today, I would just say it's where single women would seek to get a vision of a mate they're about to meet. But sorry, these old stories may not have been transcribed into multi-gender and same-gender variations. So I hope nobody objects when I say women looking for a mate. I do get called out about that sometimes, but I think people of these gender variations would be able to transcribe and present that version better than I would as well. Anyway, that could be a good writing and drama careers for some people. Anyway, to continue through the story I learned, the women were visiting Lazare's well and Bridget's wells for mating visions. And this is something by tradition that was done at Imbolc at beginning of February. And the legend of the lesser known Lazare is less well known than the Breda ones, but they're quite similar. The reference to Breda, she travels around Ireland with her cows, but Lazare, she travels around with her sheep. And one of the rituals of Bealtaine is that it's the start of the sheep shearing season, although that does tend to get later and later in Ireland, but it wasn't so long ago that sheep shearing would start up about now. So the vision of women in wells at Imbolc has kind of moved forward. It's not done very much now, but it was moved forward. So instead of looking for the vision in Imbolc, since the Gregorian calendar days, it's something that women have done on the May Day Eve, on the 30th of April. Maybe they've been doing that for the last couple of hundred years ago. Unfortunately, women who wait until the 31st of April are totally screwed. They're out of luck with this. Anyway, I've got a poem that I love to share at every opportunity I can. Regular viewers here will have heard it, but it's not a poem of mine. It's an adaptation of a poem by Robin Williamson, founder of Incredible String Band. And he said he adapted it from William Blake, who is said to have actually translated it himself from a Donegal Shanachie. And Robin calls his version the Verses of Powers. He relates it to somewhere in Wales. But I call it Lazare's Well because it fits so well. And it's about women's visions from a well. And for this, I'm actually going to track it down, and I'm going to encore this from where I told it outside the tree labyrinth last year. So I trust you'll enjoy me telling it from that again. So this is the Lazare's Well poem. If it'll come up.
Old women stare at a water. They do not see a face, just days that have gone by. And when young women stare at a water, they do not see a face, just some image of desire. Now if you stare into a water expecting no reflected dream, you will see your first love, because Lazare is a lover of the flowing earth and its four dancers. She says the light will always be brilliant to anyone who cherishes colour, yellow flowers. I asked her, but what if there was no heaven? She says, touch my breast and see the green fields turn into blossoms. For her songs are all of love, lifelong. Into every green and blue yonder her glass harp rings as it ripples through her rivers. Our cherished sins we let go to float away, voiceless. And when we do this, she will embrace us with blossom. She'll always forgive us and seal us with her blessing. So I say my farewell to hell and to heaven, both made in man's mind of fancy and fear. So I say my farewell to all that does not matter, that's made in a coward's heart, such as asking questions, I suppose. All that we learn is listening to the birds singing. So all that we learn is about each day that she made you.
Sarah, I just love listening to that poem as well as saying it. So I hope you don't mind me doing that one again. But I'm going to stay with wells a moment longer, because another well tradition is the farmer man, and this is referring to you and rubbing the dew on your face, Val. Farmers' men, and getting there before the dog, and the farmers' men would come to sacred holy wells just before or at sunrise, and more recently on the 1st of May, to drink, maybe bathe in it. But first of all, obviously drink before the bathing, but to cleanse themselves, to increase their stamina. They believe they increase their stamina. Maybe so they don't disappoint the women's vision the evening before, of course. Maybe also to have the stamina to consummate and breed sons and daughters to eventually help with their work. Again, something else I'm going to be talking about with the hawthorn next week quite a bit. But really, I assume that the main concern of farmers drinking at the time of the frost, of the dew, first thing at sunrise, is to increase their stamina. That's the belief of that. And they're needing that for all of the extra farming work. It's going to start from now right through the summer. It's about to happen. So it's part of a ritual. I don't know, it's really going away from this a little bit, but there's a breeder's well, a breeder's head in Wicklow. And when it was a thriving fishing community there, the fishermen used to actually go to the well at Breeder's Head, and they would do the same thing. They would drink from it, bathe from it, and there'd be their protection so that when they go out on their fishing boats, they'll be protected from the weather and they will get a good harvest. So this is similar for the farmers. So extending from that, farmers' wells at sunrise on May extend this tradition to their cattle, and they get there first. And perhaps the last annual example of this in Ireland stopped only about 30 years ago. And it was a tiny village, you might be familiar with it, that is quite hidden, called Strone City in Kerry. And there was a phenomenal place at the May weekend. It was just a fair. It was huge. It was mating dances, a huge celebration. It's funny, you go to the field now, there's hardly any houses there, and you wonder what the heck went on. But anyway, there, part of the ritual was the farmers would be there before everybody arrived. They would drink from the well, blah, blah, blah. And then they would bring their cattle to drink from the well. And the farmers had the sense, of course, to get to the well before the cattle did. But this was the one day of the year that the cattle were actually allowed to drink from these sacred wells. Before I move on with this, let's see what you're saying on that. Right, it is. Okay, we got you. Right, no extra words from you at the moment. Let's see what you got to say from the next bit. Because I talked about the cattle drinking from the well. What's more known for this time is driving the cattle through the twin fires. So either before or after the well drink by the cattle, they were driven between two fires. And the ritual is viewed as a mystical thing But from what I gather, it was actually quite a practical ritual. It's not done so much now because cattle are shedded and they're fed silage and hay and fed through the winter. But cattle used to be moved from the lowland to the highland land around, this was the time after this fair, the Bealtaine fair, they'd be driven up into the hills. Although in Clare, you might have seen documentaries of the Burren recently, it's a kind of reverse. This is the time when the cattle are actually brought down from the high points to the low, because it actually gets too hot on that bare limestone in summer. But that heating through the summer actually keeps the stones warm, so it's good for the cattle to be there in the winter. That's why that's reversed. And part of the celebration, whether the cattle are being driven up or if it's in the Burren in Clare, they're coming down, they used to adorn cattle with yellow flowers to protect them and to so that they would remain healthy through the year. And of course, that's especially important if it's milking cattle. So the yellow flower tradition has gone on to them as well. So there was a practical purpose of running the cattle between the fires, and that was to burn off the insects. And any insect eggs that are laid, they were running between the fires, they'd be close together. And I'm so sorry I don't have the photos and a little video. I had tech problems getting them up to show you bits of this. But as they run between the fires, then all the sparks would burn their fur a bit and hopefully reduce any of the insects on them that's lodged into the fur. So it's like it's almost like cattle shearing in a way, and so really that is a cleansing ritual, just like the wells. So the twin fire running the cattle rituals have actually been reenacted. People, although it stopped maybe 30 years ago, we don't have the tourists at the moment now, but it was something that got reenacted. I know Kinnetty Castle in Offaly, they did this, reenacted this for a few years. But more people are perhaps familiar of the reenactment of the Festival of Fires at Ushnik. And that's just one big fire, isn't it? Ushnik, the Mead, the centre of Ireland, the centre of Éire. But this has not happened over the last two Bealtaines because of the COVID. But there's a lot of horses there at Ushnik. There isn't cattle. So you got all these horses around the big fire. And so that we have two rituals of May Day that are cleansing, they're about cleansing, it's water and fire. But even with infections and viruses, it's fire and heat that were used in ancient times. Look at all these stone sweat houses that were popped up, especially in medieval times, to drive viruses away. And people were put into the sweat houses. The fire had been on, it heated up all the stones of the sweat house. People would get in there and they would sweat away. And then they would have buckets of water thrown on them. So there you go. You got the cleansing with the fire and water, even in the sweat house situation. And sacred water maybe. But even part of heating and cooking our food is for cleansing as well. Excuse me. We think of it heating for taste, but it also unlocks some nutrients that perhaps might not be accessible when the food is raw. But certainly the heating gets rid of harmful enzymes and bacteria. They're destroyed. Unfortunately, some of the good enzymes and bacteria are too with cooking. But hence, we have a recommendation that when you actually cook meat and fish, do have some raw fruits and veggies with those cooked meats and fish, and that's where you get the balance of the enzymes. Anyway, why am I going into a cookery lesson here? But even the iron cooking pots that people love, the cast iron ones, before they're used, they're fired up to kill off any lingering harmful bacteria and enzymes that might have crept in during storage. Without further comments, let's move on to the Maybush now, because that's in the title, isn't it? It's in the title for these Nature Folklore Sessions. And I said I'll be talking about hawthorn more so next Sunday, and hopefully we'll have a lot more. We'll have guests. We'll be back to guests, back to photos next Sunday. But the Maybush tradition and the hawthorn is very much the same thing. So this is the part 1 edition of that. With Bealtaine moved now to 1st of May because of the Gregorian calendar, and because the white blossoms of hawthorn are usually not out yet, the newer tradition of picking and tying yellow flowers, because the hawthorn flowers are not out, you might have picked up from the story I told earlier, this would be hung on the maybush or the wishing tree. So going back to what I was talking about, rolling in the dew and yellow flowers, and another tradition is that we wipe our eyes like Raoul did. Wipe your eyes with the morning 1st May dew. But the full tradition of that is, well, I should have picked these. Well, I did actually, and I did wipe my eyes. Funny enough, I didn't think of the tradition, I just did it. But when you pick this posy, you're supposed to actually pick this when the frost is there, or when the frost is just melted and there's actually dew on them. So the tradition is to actually wipe the dew off the yellow flowers here, then wipe your eyes from the yellow flowers. And that's the full tradition that we perhaps might take shortcuts on. And a reason for doing this, and you'll love this, the reason for doing this is if we do this, follow the tradition exactly, and pick the flowers at when the frost has turned to dew and wipe our eyes, it's said that's when we can see the fairies a lot clearer. So that had to come in somewhere, didn't it? And so it all ties in with the celebration and the rituals of yellow flowers, that because the white ones are not out yet, it's all about the fairy tree and the maybush. And of course, yellow flowers these days, a lot of that's been replaced by tying cluties, ribbons, rags, rag trees. And now it tends to be the ribbons and rags that hold the wishes and prayers. Sometimes people make up a little cross or a grass thing. It used to be when you put the yellow flowers on, you've got your wishes, you're seeing the fairies, but you're also transporting your wishes and prayers as well. So I brought that up because a lot of people might not be familiar with the yellow flowers as part of that tradition. And as well as ribbons, now people are hanging rosary beads. They've taken over a lot of these wishing trees. But the flowers on a maybush is still a tradition in parts of Wexford. It's not completely out. It reminds me a bit of Christmas tree traditions. You know how we hang the baubles, which were once upon a time apples. And apples are for wishing as well. So the apples there for midwinter wishing, hanging on the Christmas tree. So this is very similar with yellow flowers on the May tree, on the Maybush. Now there's a children's tradition. You might be familiar with this if you've gone to the Ducas archives, ducas.ie, lovely archives of children's stories there over the ages. And there's a tradition talked of, and it seems to be quite well faded now. And this involves carrying, I didn't do it this year, I did it last year, but I've got a hawthorn tree. I'm not supposed to brought this in. It's done this, there's a lot of things about not bringing this in. I won't go into it, it's not in flower. But these flowers would be hung on a little hawthorn tree. This is a maybush. This is how a maybush would be. It might even be a branch taken off a hawthorn and put into a pot or a vase, and they'd have the yellow flowers tied to it. And that was set up as the maybush, and I think it's still done in Wexford. Please tell me if you see that done in your areas. But this maybush will be carried by a girl or a woman who has not had children. So this is quite similar to the Imbolc tradition, that the British crosses, or especially the breed dolls, were made by women that hadn't had their children yet. Some people say it's a virgin woman, but in ancient times that wasn't it. From what I understand, a virgin woman was a woman who hadn't had a child yet, and that in a way can be your explanation of the Virgin Mary. It wasn't actually she was physically a virgin, it's that she hadn't had children yet, and I think that's where there's been a translation change. But with the yellow flowers on, it did become a kind of a door-to-door begging thing in Victorian times, because that was being done by the mummers at Christmas, so on, penny for the guy, all this sort of stuff. So unfortunately, the wee pot with the Maybush and the flowers was door-to-door as a begging or as a charity fundraising now. But that's in itself is a huge variation from the original. Because in the original tradition, the girl, the woman who hadn't had child, who was carrying the Maybush, all of the children around her be singing a rhyme, and you'll be familiar with this rhyme. Here we go gathering nuts in May, nuts in May, nuts in May. But where the hell are you going to find nuts in May? You're not going to find any nuts on trees in May. Now, this is a misspelled pronunciation, because nut is nut and not. It's funny. I'd actually say K-N-O-T as nut. And it sounds like nut, doesn't it? It just comes with whatever accent I picked up over the time. But anyway, nut is, put a plum in my throat, not. Nut is really nut. And again, I'm picking this up. Look, I've got a wee, if you can see, I've got a wee tie here. You know that as a knot. Today we'll call this a posy, don't we? We call this actually, I'm getting into a mix. Maybe I don't need to get that out again. We call that a posy today, but it used to be called as a knot. And it's a knot isn't really the strictly the string. It's describing a bunch of flowers tied with a piece of string. That's a knot. It comes from a Saxon word. I forget what the exact Saxon word. And of course, the frosty morning, it could be a dewy morning. So, as I've mentioned, the shift from Bealtaine, that is shift from the sidereal time to the 1st of May. So the tradition of hawthorn to yellow flowers moved. And that tradition was to ensure some of the cold frost dew was on the knot or the posy of the yellow flowers. That's the important feature of this. Those flowers should be carrying some of that morning dew. And the reason for that, and this is where I'm going to come back to, where I think fire festivals, the fire imagery, is only half the story here. Because on May Day is the time, and we've got the longer days now, and it's the time when the May Day sun warms the water. And if you've got water, again, I am picking this out again. If this was freshly picked, and especially if I had marsh marigolds, and you'll understand this if you go around gardens think of going around gardens after a drizzle, after a rainstorm. Go around gardens after the frost has melted, after the dew. What happens? The sun comes along, it warms the water and dew on the flowers, and you get the greatest fragrance of the day from the flowers. And what does fragrance from the flowers do? It attracts the pollinators, it attracts the bees, it attracts all of these little animals as a symbol and an action of fertility. So that's what I believe this is about. It's not about fires, strictly, not about water and wells. It's about the reaction of that frost and dewy morning on the flowers. It's the effect of the drizzle, the April showers maybe, that have dampened the soil. The sun is coming down and it's warming it all up and fragrancing all up. And the one thing about the flowers on the hawthorn when it comes up, and I'll talk about this next week again, but the yellow flowers are replacing it, is saying that the fragrance of hawthorn teases the wombs of women, especially if you could get that hawthorn and again, it's got dew on it and the sun gets on it. And when the scent of hawthorn flowers come out and tempts the womb of women, it's said to have tempted them to become lustful. And you may have heard of the phrase, I put a tune up on my Facebook, the lusty month of May. So maybe, in a way, that's why Gregory changed the calendar from the sidereal time when the hawthorns were coming out to May the 1st, where the flowers weren't out, and we had to get these yellow flowers as a way to please the church and enforce an earlier date for Bealtaine so the simple lustiness will be diluted down. Anyway, that's just a theory. But there's an important point there. With the running of the cattle through the Twin Fires and the massive bonfire at Ushnik, people now believe that Bealtaine is a fire festival. And there's also stories told about Mabe being the goddess of Bealtaine. And she's also being the conductor of rudders who take some of the fire from Ushnik to all parts of the island to share. But to me, there's too much crossover there with Sawan. I think wires are being crossed with that story. You may have your own opinions on that. If you do, put them in the comments for me now. But to me, a fire festival is only half of that translation. And it doesn't make sense for me. But the sun and the fire warming the dew, that makes a lot of sense. And the warming up, as I say, it happens in the soil, it happens on the trees, it happens on the plants. There's all this water on all the living things being warmed up by the sun. The cold water is being warmed up, and that's what's being celebrated, I believe. So this is a time of warming the water on the plants, on the trees, in the soil, and that brings all this pollinating action and creating fragrance, and that ensures the fertility for the summer growing and the harvest to come. But add to this, it is a matchmaking time, and I'm sure the USA spring break has origins in this too, in this May tradition. So that's it. So that's why you have spring break over in the USA, I think. It's just a bring over from the May traditions from here. But anyway, moving on with nuts in May. As I say, here we go in nuts in May, nuts in May. Who will go with me in nuts in May, nuts in May? Well, Sinead is going with nuts in May. Sinead is going with nuts in May. But who will go with you for nuts in May? Who will go with you for nuts in May? And Seamus is going with you for nuts in May. Seamus is going with you for nuts in May. And so it goes on. So I hope that explains something a bit more for you. I'm going to move on about the May Queen, because though she's an English Wales and part of Scotland tradition, somehow it seems to be linked as the development from this mating dance chant. Or maybe it was the other way around. But the May bush carrier, like the May bush carrier, the May Queen's a girl who's not had children yet. And she's the bringer of the sun and the warmth and fertility. And she declares that the mating time, the mating season is open. But she also gives blessings for the pollinating on all the harvest to come. No actual Bealtaine goddesses, though, because the month of May seems to be from a Greek word for Maya, Maya. And that she was the eldest of 7 nymphs of the Pleiades. And Pleiades happens to be a star group within the constellation Taurus. And in the middle of when the sun is in Taurus, astrologically, that happens to be the midpoint of Bealtaine, too, the sidereal time. And Bealtaine seems to have come from a god, an Egyptian god Baal, and of course he's May. But his tradition would have certainly arrived with the immigrant farmers from that came in to ancient Ireland, they say from Turkey, from Iberia, Spain and Portugal. So Maya is now regarded as the May Queen, and that's where the word May is said to have come from, Esmir or Maya. But in Ireland, we have Maeve, and she's said to be the goddess for Bealtaine now. It's said to be, that's said to be a 5,000-year-old custom, but I would say that became an association that was rumbled up during the 19th century, during the Celtic Revival Age. Anyway, Tara is said to always had a priestess of Maeve, and the Bealtaine, the chieftain, was appointed to actually go to Maeve's wrath, which is in Tara as well, in County Meath. And she's, there'd be a woman that'd be appointed as being Maeve's servant or Maeve's queen on earth. And she would be living and being in Maeve's wrath. And so a chieftain who had been gathering Tara would be appointed to actually lie and couple with her. And this coupling is said to have secured the fertility for the whole of Erin, for the whole of the land, everything that grows, everything that's reared by this coupling at the Rath, May's Rath. So that's sort of opposite to the end of the year version of the Sawan, Dagda, and the mating with the Morrigu story, which I've told here a few times. Anyway, after the coupling of Maeve and her chosen mate, fires are said to have been lit and all over Erin. So that's a variation of the fires being distributed from Ushnik. It's just a slight variation on that. So some say that the fire, a big fire at Ushnik, had to be lit first. But my own belief is this fire festival, all this fire came from the 19th century. And even the tradition of driving cattle through the twin flames. But you might be able to tell me different. But this is, as I say, I always come back to this idea of the warm sun on the dew and the frost, and that enhances the fragrances, the pollination. And I think big fires could be a waste of time. Save the fuel for Sawan, I say. Save the fuel for then. So, anyone here with any comments? Because I'm just about to come to a close. Come up with your comments as well. The start of a new, that's what I think, from Lillian here. Thank you. So, comment on that. So, I'm going to finish off. It's not one that you see here very much, but it's the Maypole. And because it's connected with apples, I love this one. So, from the May Queen, we have the Maypole. And that seems to come from Anglo-Saxon tradition, I think. It's hardly seen in Ireland, but it's very much a tradition through the UK. And some say that the Romans actually brought the Maypole to Britain, not the Saxons. But the Saxons were, it's like the Borg, isn't it? Where the Romans, what they did is they took over cultures and assimilated them, and that would be part of the culture. So maybe the Maypole tradition of the Saxons got embedded in the whole Roman culture, and that's why it's thought to come from Rome. Anyway, I'm thinking of it as a Roman tradition. But what tree was used for the wood, for the pole, for the Maypole? Some think that this is a symbol of the tree of life, an oak, an ash, elm maybe. But considering as being of Saxon origin, because apples were a huge meaning of life support in the Saxon area and Germanic areas, I'm thinking that the Maypole was originally an apple trunk. And I've heard stories that there will be a selection of the most elder of the apple trees in an orchard. And of course, the Saxons brought wassailing, winter wassailing to Britain to celebrate the apple harvest and bless the trees so there'd be more. And that's a tradition went from really England into borders of Scotland, certainly into Wales. And it came into Southeast Ireland too. It's now pretty active in Southeast Ireland, in Wexford, Waterford, Tipperary. So you got the oldest tree in the orchard. It had its branches stripped, but the oldest tree wouldn't have been producing many apples anyway. And Saxons were very much into fruit tree grafting at that time, way back then. So what is said that the branches were cut off the elder apple tree, and then they'd be grafted, branches from that grafted onto crabapple bases, and that formed fresh, young, productive trees. So after all the branches are stripped off the older apple tree, that then became the Maypole. And the dance was to honor and bless the new trees that will grow now from its branches. So all I have with yellow flowers and wishing trees, that's all I have today with that. Sorry not having the photos and other traditions of that. I'm going to continue more with guests, with the fairy tree, with the hawthorns next week. But please, if you've got any Count 10 poem stories, contact me so we can share them next week. Any more comments from you, from people around? I'm so sorry about the throat. I'll get my voice back, but I've been on for a long time anyway. Oh, Linda. And you're not too late because you can watch for the beginning. It's going to be archived. And Sherry, I'm glad you enjoyed it, but don't go away yet. As I mentioned, thank you for those that are patron subscribers. And coming up in Nature Folklore Sessions now, as I say, is Stories for May, Fairy Stories for May. And I think I might actually have a picture for that. Let's see. I think I actually did get some, I think we got some wee pictures to show you what's coming up. There's the first photos of the day. There you go. So there we go. There's a hawthorn tree. There's we got Stories for May. That's one's on Tara there. And then on the 16th of May, we have Biodiversity in Soil and Our Connections to This. There's a lovely biodiverse woodland that's St. John's in Roscommon by Loch Ree. So that's going to be another hands-on one there. But there is going to be some nature folklore thrown in. And then we're really going back into the folklore on the 23rd of May, which is going to be a lovely session on water folklore. I'm looking forward to that. We might see if we can get Sarah Humboldt back on for that one of all as well. So let's see what, before we go, let's see what you're saying before at the end. And Sherry, the hawthorn flowers are so similar to mountain laurel. I wonder if the mountain laurel does have a tradition, but the hawthorn is so defined. There's hawthorn species all over the world. And I know some of the ones, and maybe your way in Maine, I know some of the hawthorns when I was up in Upper Michigan. I gather they go over the Canadian border. And also in North Carolina, in Washington State, also around the Mediterranean. They're haws, they're lovely, they're much tastier than ones we have here, because the hawthorns are a good additive. Of course, they're great for heart problems and so forth, but they make you pee a lot. But the ones through Mediterranean and North USA, they got a strawberry taste. Lovely, they got huge floral fragrance, but they have a strawberry taste. They're lovely. People make lovely wine and jams and jellies with them. So if you're watching this broadcast as an archive later, please keep commenting here, because I do return from time to time to answer the comments. Please subscribe. There's bells. I know there's bell there on the YouTube, and I think Facebook has it now. I don't know, because I'm not watching that. And it gives the details each week of the next Sunday session. So click the bell. Have a safe week full of wonder, inspirations, lots of wishes, wonderful wishes, blessings for the summer to come, even though it's going to be a bit late this May here, but wishing you lots of enchantments. So until next Sunday, play well, and that's all I've got from me today. Thank you so much for watching on this holiday time when there's a lot of other competition and a lot of other streams on. So it's bye from me. Thank you very much.